It's Thursday, and from now on we're going to have a very special feature for Throwback Thursday, which is covering iconic films in the history of films. And we're starting with comedy films in the first 5 decades of cinematic history. It's Throwback Thursday, and I know you're all excited to know what are we going to cover today. Well, as I mentioned, we're doing something different. We're going to start covering films, iconic films, over the decades, since the beginning of film and the industry began. And I think we are going to start first of all with a comedy feature on a whole series. We're going to cover it in 2 parts because there's a lot to cover. We're going to start with the 1920s, and let's just get straight into it. First of all, we have a film called The General, which was made in 1926. That is almost 100 years ago. It features the iconic actor Buster Keaton, also featuring Marion Mack and Glenn Cavender. It's a silent film. And for those of you that are thinking, why would I watch a silent film? Why would I watch a black and white? Why would I watch a film that's 100 years old? Well, this shows you the origins of film. It shows you how film first began. It shows you the evolution. You can see how the process began from where it was in those early stages all the way to the way you see films now. And it's really interesting. Even if you're not interested from a technical point of view about how films are made, it's interesting to see how storylines, how plot features, how the whole structure was set up and how films were actually made. Using the limited technology which they did have in those days. And you had to be really creative. Let's get straight into it. So the storyline is that Johnny is a Confederate engineer. Johnny is played by Buster Keaton, and he must save his locomotive. It's a hilarious journey which ensues, which also he has to save his girlfriend Annabelle. He has to save her life, and it really wasn't well received by audiences or even by critics when it first came out, which is the case for so many iconic films now. But it does have cultural and historical value, and that's what people are really focused on. So it's like stepping back in time and looking at what history, what the culture was like, and also the perception of how they saw the American Civil War back in 1926. So this is now able to be streamed free on YouTube. So you can watch it free of charge. Watch it. Let's jump into the 1930s. So the 1930s in the US, as some of you historians or buffing history fans may know, was the time of the Great Depression. It was a really tough time. I mean, it hit Europe in the 1920s, but it was a really tough time in the 1930s. And a lot of very interesting novels and also films came out as a result, which highlighted the plight of normal Americans. And none other typifies some of the classic films, such as this one, which was by the Marx Brothers, and it is called Duck Soup. And it is a classic. It was made in 1933, right in the heart and right in the midst of the Great Depression. It features the 3 brothers, which is Groucho, Harpo, and Chico Marx, and the plot revolves around a fictional dictator called Rufus T. Firefly, his war on the neighboring nation, and 2 incompetent spies who can't keep track of which side they're on. Once again, the film was not a financial success. It was panned by critics, but now, decades, almost 100 years later, it has been recognized as a cultural classic, and one of those films you really have to watch. And it is available streaming on Apple TV. So the third film that you have to watch was set, of course, in the 1940s. Actually, it was released in 1942. And like a lot of these films that we're covering today, it was made in the US. And because it was made in the US, it follows, and you can also see the historical importance of the way the US was culturally and also politically at that time. And so this was set in the time of the Second World War. This was actually filmed and it was released. And the film is called To Be or Not to Be, and features Carole Lombard, Jack Benny, and Robert Stack. And many films were made during the time of the Second World War, but this one really captures the essence of maybe America's stance or position because they were following a policy of isolationism at the time. And then they got drawn into the Second World War when the attack on Pearl Harbor took place by the Japanese, and then everything followed on from there. And only then was this film actually released. So the premise of the film, which is a black comedy, is it's set in Nazi-occupied Poland, where a group of actors disguise themselves and get involved in a Polish soldier's effort to track down a German spy. It's basically a satire against Germans, and as I said, it was at a time when the US was following a policy of isolationism, and so public opinion was still very much divided at the time. But of course that changed when America entered the war. And this film is actually available, it's streaming free on archive.org. So check it out, it will be interesting. So the fourth film that you have to watch is an adaptation of a play. And it is an amazing play. It's actually one of my favorite plays. I have a massive personal interest in this. I'm very biased. It is The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. Well, the play is by Oscar Wilde. The film is a 1952 film featuring Michael Redgrave and Richard Waters. And it is a classic, it is a comedy, it's a farce, it is hilarious. It is, I guess it's a mirror on society at the time in the 1900s, at the turn of the century, what high society was like, and the antics that some of the people got up to, and the language, the flow, the comedy, the plotline is absolutely perfect. In my opinion, it is perfect. And I really do think you should watch this. Just in case you don't know what the storyline of The Importance of Being Earnest is about, but it's about the confusion that arises when two men both pretend to be someone they are not. And as I said, it is considered to be one of the absolute classics. It is Oscar Wilde, one of his most famous pieces of work. It is a very short play, and the film is amazing. I would recommend you definitely watch that, and you'll be surprised. And then you can read the play if you haven't read it already. It is actually streaming free on YouTube, so there's no excuse not to watch it. So the last film that we're going to cover in this first part, which is the last film of 5, is a classic from the 1960s. Now you've probably heard this, it's called Dr. Strangelove. It features Peter Sellers. It's one of those films that everyone talks about, directed by Stanley Kubrick, so you know it's going to be good. This is just before he did The Shining. It's a classic. It's meant to be an absolute masterpiece. Actually, the original title was much longer, or the official title is much longer. It is actually called How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. It is a satire, it is a comedy, it is almost slapstick, and of course it's got Peter Sellers. And Peter Sellers, for those of you that know from the days of Pink Panther and all the characters that he played, he was almost perfect in his encapsulating of roles, in his characterization, in being able to transform and take a script and turn it into an absolute masterpiece on stage or on film. And Peter Sellers does that with Dr. Strangelove. As I said, it was directed by Stanley Kubrick, and the plot line is that in the aftermath of World War II, leading into the Cold War between the US and Russia, Dr. Strangelove portrays an unhinged American general, and he is very unhinged, trust me, and he orders the bombing of his country's newest enemy and the consequent efforts of his war room trying to frantically prevent the escalation of nuclear magnitude. So it's somewhat a very extreme version of what people were thinking could happen if someone got hold of the so-called button. But it is a classic, it is a comedy, and it is Peter Sellers at one of his finest moments in cinematic history. So definitely watch it. It is streaming on Apple TV. And that, my friends, is all we have time for today in part 1 of the top films you should watch over the past 5 and the first 5 decades in the 20s right up to the 60s. Next week we'll give you part 2, which will cover from the 70s until present time. So check out our reels, keep following us, and I hope you enjoy those films.